I'm Kim Waddell. And I am one of the project co-leads for the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Planning Team based here in St. Thomas. Today is the third of 3 islands workshops that we're doing here in the territory. We've done St. Thomas earlier and St. John earlier in the week, and then today we're finishing on a high note by focusing on St. Croix. So what I'm going to do is provide a few opening comments, and then depending on, we were having some technical difficulty with our keynote speaker, Professor Olasee Davis. Hopefully we can resolve that by the time I get through my opening remarks. If not, what we'll do is try and move his presentation a little bit later in the process this morning, but hopefully we can resolve that shortly. So let me go ahead and go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, I'm one of the co-leads for the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plan. And so let me provide a little bit of background on this. All states, territories, sometimes large cities, counties as well, are required to maintain a hazard mitigation plan, keep it updated. And that has to be done every 5 years. If a jurisdiction has an updated hazard mitigation plan that's been approved by the governor and by FEMA, that allows them to be eligible on an annual basis for additional federal funding, specifically from FEMA. And historically, this has been known as pre and post mitigation funding. And so these are opportunities to address things in the plan that required additional support and gives stakeholders, whether it's agencies or community organizations, opportunities to apply for funding to address a specific mitigation need. That's now falling under a new program called BRIC, which is Building Resilience and Infrastructure in Communities. And that's been in place with FEMA for about the last, I think, 2 years, but this year I think they're really ramping up. Again, having an updated plan also allows.
Yeah, we in now.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to put anything here?
Yeah, I put on my face.
No.
Oh.
All right, thank you, Olasee. Anyway, that allows us to, or jurisdictions to get additional funding from the EPA or NOAA, et cetera. And then finally, none of these plans really work or get implemented without large levels of public support. And so this is an opportunity for the plan to reflect those interests, those needs in the community, and the public understands what the opportunities and needs are and supports the plan both by articulating their desires with the decision makers and politicians in their jurisdiction. But ideally, you want to focus on recovery, resilience, and risk reduction initiatives. Next slide, please. So these plans aren't simple. And here at UVI, we've targeted a framework an approach that you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, where, for example, the activity we're doing today, we can consider as stakeholder engagement, specifically focusing on the natural resource sector. And we also are doing a great deal of assessment of analysis, and this is more traditional needs of a hazard mitigation plan to profile the hazards, look at the environmental conditions and see, their ability to resist or mitigate the impacts of hazards. We're doing a risk assessment, both of the communities, but primarily of the built environment relative to the hazards. And then we want to look at the sustainability. But all of these, along with the stakeholder engagement, are part of the process. And that process then leads to a series of outcomes. The first level, which is developing mitigation strategies from, again, all this input, as well as the analysis, and a planning framework. So how do we want to structure this? Where do we want to take it? And then ultimately, this leads to a series of policy recommendations that focus on, in our case, resilience and sustainability. And all of that feeds into a resilience plan that is sent to the governor for sign off and approval, and then he forwards the plan to FEMA themselves for their approval. This plan can't really be done easily without support from other partners. And so, for example, today we're partnering with Texas A&M University at Corpus Christi, their Hart Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies. We contracted with them to help us develop this natural resource sector analysis, but we've turned to other universities as well as private consultants. These consultants often have subject matter expertise that we don't have here in the territory or here at the university. So together with our partners, we are generating, like I said, a series of strategies and ultimately a plan. But underlying all of this is this issue of resilience. And that's an additional term that FEMA asked us to include. And that really, and I'll talk more about that shortly, but that resilience component really allows us to think more long-term, think about planning ahead, but taking into consideration things like climate change, and which includes things like sea level rise and warmer temperatures that might affect public health and things like that. But also looking at, how does this affect our communities and what can we do to make our communities, our natural ecosystems, and our built environment more resilient for the future. And that's how we're looking at this planning process. Next slide. So as I mentioned, climate change is one of the elements that we've factored in, and this, believe it or not, this is one of the first hazard mitigation plans that's actively looking at the impacts of climate change. And what we're seeing, and we know that for those of you that have lived here for a while, that climate change is amplifying the intensity of these natural hazards. And obviously, the 2017 hurricanes, both the fact that they were back to back was bad enough, but the fact that they were intense, category 5s, which was often fed by the energy coming off of warmer seawater, which strengthens these storms, is a case in point. But we're also living in a place that's vulnerable to earthquakes, tsunamis, and after heavy rain events or hurricanes, we see landslides. But more recently, we've seen longer droughts. We've had a drought here in the territory for the last 3-4 months easily, although we've had a little respite here in St. Thomas and St. John. The drought still persists, and we have to pay attention. This obviously has impacts on our farmers and gardeners, as well as just the hillsides being a lot browner. But we have this chronic effect of climate change, exemplified by sea level rise, and I mentioned the warmer temperatures, and the temperatures not just of the sea, but on land. And that, like I said, may foster hazards such as public health hazards, disease and what have you. Next slide, please. So looking at, obviously the focus has been the natural hazards, characterizing them, understanding the potential of their impacts, but we want to look at them through in 2 major areas. One on the left-hand side is the critical infrastructure that provides, a lot of our structure and governance throughout the territory. I mean, in addition to governance and the government's ability to actually provide the services, we have energy, transportation, communication. And then today, like I said, we're focusing on our natural systems. The infrastructure is essential for generating the services that we rely on that keep our economy going. And these include housing, education, our healthcare system, and obviously our natural systems and agriculture go hand in hand because agriculture is a managed natural system. But all of these we evaluate them, looking at the risks, looking at the hazards, looking at the vulnerabilities of these services and infrastructure through the lens of resilience based on these impacts. And ultimately, what we want is a distillation of recommendations and strategies that lead to a more resilient Virgin Islands. Next slide, please. So what we've done, we've been at this for about 18 months, almost 2 years. And, obviously we're doing a fair bit of planning and implementation, which implementation is actually what we're looking at for the year ahead. But what we've done so far is done a fair bit of technical research, looking at the impacts of climate change and hazards, and their, as I mentioned before, their impact on essential services, infrastructure, and so forth. But we're doing activities like community outreach, like this webinar, or workshop rather, and we have op-ed pieces in the newspaper or on online media. But we're also doing interviews, field work, data collection, and looking at the root causes of some of these challenges that persist, even under good conditions between our disasters. Because ultimately, we want to see how our systems in the built environment and the natural environment and in our community, how they function and persist. And that requires a level of understanding that's a little bit deeper. Next slide. So when we think about our natural systems and the resilience, I think there are a number of issues that we have to look at that negatively impact them. And so underlying, these disaster risks are, for example, unplanned and rapid urbanization. So here in the territory, we've not had a comprehensive land and water use plan for, I think, close to 40 years. And so we've seen development in places that probably shouldn't have been done, but we don't have a plan. We don't have a strategy for mapping out the type of economic development or growth that we want based on a plan. We also have poverty and inequality here across the territory, and those, the more vulnerable populations are at greater risk to some of these hazards and disasters. And then obviously, again, climate change and the variability. I mean, the fact that we have, droughts that are indeterminate length, and then suddenly we get a series of heavy rain events. But when we get them, it's not as seasonal, predictable as we've seen in years past. I mean, the fact that we had a tropical storm this past week, almost out of season, and we're not into the hurricane season yet. So these are just examples of that variability. But we also have compounding factors. So the demographic change, after every storm, major storm, hurricane here, we see a dip in our population, but a population spurt can also compound the issue in the sense that, where do people live and where do things get developed? We also see unsustainable uses of our natural resources, which almost directly influence the decline of our ecosystems. And those ecosystems provide benefits, which is the focus of today's workshop. And we really want to understand that and understand the trade-offs behind that. So these are just some of the elements that, along with economic impacts or pandemics, like we're still in the midst of, all of these are confounding factors that affect our natural systems and their resilience. Next slide. So ultimately, we want this plan to provide a number of recommendations that, number one, increase the robustness, the durability, and the strength to resist impacts of our systems, both in the natural world, but in the built environment. And then the service delivery, i.e., regular, reliable sources of electricity or telecommunication or water. These are key services that keep our society and our culture running. We also want to emphasize this issue of operations. We don't want to just keep building for building's sake. What we build has to be maintained, has to operate, and contribute to the overall robustness and reliability of the systems that they are a part of. And obviously that requires capacity. And so the university is uniquely positioned to work with stakeholders in the private sector and the public sector to provide training for the workforce of today and tomorrow. And we have to do that with collaborations with the private sector, outside entities, whether it's university programs, distance learning, and what have you. But again, all of this only operates when we have community buy-in. And so one of the things we hope to do is by identifying a set of values and approaches and strategies that hopefully will unify the communities, because we have, as you well know, we have a very diverse community that's in some ways somewhat fragmented, whether it's by language or religion or by island or what have you. But the fact is we should be coming together as Virgin Islanders, recognizing the importance of hazard mitigation and resilience, and that set of values would hopefully increase community cohesion. Next slide. So when we, I know a number of folks at Texas A&M, and when we thought about the sector analysis, I reached out to my colleague David Yoskowitz, who will be speaking a little bit later in the workshop, and we wanted a series of tasks for them to address, and so their sector analysis for our resources includes these four major objectives. So first and foremost, to help us understand and quantify and qualify the benefits we get from the natural environment, especially those benefits that pertain to mitigating hazards or enhanced resilience. We also want to ask them to characterize how changes in our land use and the patterns of land use have impacted the services that we get from the environment, and identify opportunities for targeted management, hopefully with the ultimate goal of sustainable use of our natural resources here in the territory. They'll touch upon this today, but this is something that hopefully we plant a seed for, which is this trade-off analysis. They'll provide a couple of examples on ecosystem service provision, given land use changes or practices. And then they have two examples today, Cane Bay and Great Pond, that they'll use, and you guys will be part of that discussion. And then finally, we want out of this analysis, with their help and specifically your input today, is to provide recommendations that we can include in the plan where we can strengthen the positive factors and enhance the resilience of our ecosystem services for the benefit of the territory. So next slide. So I'm winding down here. This was sort of my opening remarks for today. For the rest of the time today, we're going to transition next to hear from Professor Olasee Davis, who will talk about the natural and cultural history of St. Croix, with, like I said, in the context of the benefits we get from our ecosystems. And then we'll have a series of presentations from our colleagues at Texas A&M, as well as here in the Virgin Islands, who will speak to water ecosystem services and how they're related to hazard mitigation here in the territory. And then around 10:30, we'll go to a break for, depending on whether we're running a little bit long, it'll be anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. And then we'll come back and the colleagues from HART will do that sort of trade-off analysis discussion with you on Great Pond and Cane Bay. And then finally, we will have a group discussion, a series of survey questions to help get your input on, what you value, what's important to you around our natural resources that then can inform the report that Texas A&M prepares for us to be integrated into our plan. So please stick with us. That last part is absolutely essential for our efforts today. And with that, I will close, and I will ask, make sure that Professor Davis is available and ready to go. Olasee, are you prepared? Ready? You need to unmute.
Yeah, they already have my good morning. They already have my PowerPoint.
All right, there we go. All right, well, Olasee, please introduce yourself. I mean, I know you, but I don't know you that well. So please take a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself for the folks that aren't familiar with the Virgin Islands.
Okay, good morning. My name is Olasee Davis, and I work with the University of the Virgin Islands School of Agriculture, which is a new program. And my job involved in the natural and cultural resources of the Virgin Islands, but it goes beyond that. I work with many stakeholders, private, plus the government, and plus the federal government. I write for the newspaper for over 20 years. So that's an issue discussion today. I'm very familiar doing public hearing, went to court cases to protect the environment. It's a long list of things that I do over the years here in the Virgin Islands. I take thousands of students throughout the Virgin Islands, dealing with the natural resources, the impact we have, plus as well as tourists, as well as my student for UVI, people that come in. And I also work with scientists for different parts of the world, especially in Denmark. And I teach classes in Denmark as well as at the university. So my scope is pretty broad. This presentation here was done for Denmark in 2017 when we had the hurricane. And I want to focus on the impact of back then in terms of the colonial risks. They have a major impact on the environment before we may exist. And so this is based on what I present in Denmark, as well. It was presented in Minnesota, True University in Minnesota. Next, so when Columbus arrived here in 1493, but before he arrived here, the Native American been here, the Kalino, some people know them as Carre, but the name is Kalino. We do have them in the land of Dominica today. And so when Columbus came here, like I mentioned, 1493, he made a Native American. The Native American, they basically coexist with the environment. So as Columbus came, he came in the northern part of St. Croix, but he never came into the islands. He sent a boat with 25 people to look for water. At that particular time, the island was called I, which means the river. And then he changed it to St. Croix, which means Holy Cross. So this is a picture here with Columbus coming to this part of the world. Next slide. This got a picture of the Caribbean regions. We're in the northeastern part of the Caribbean, right on the horn of the Caribbean. There's a reason why the US won this island from back from 1865, going back from Abraham Lincoln. We basically in the Caribbean, with close to North America, South America, Africa. So we just have really good strategic location. And the US want the islands for basically to keep the German out, for getting a foothold in this part of the world. And of course, you know the history in 1917, the island was transferred. Treaty was 1916, and it was going to become a part of the US, for the US territory. You see Puerto Rico right next door in 1898 through the Spanish War, and they got Puerto Rico. Next slide. This natural resources of the Virgin Islands, particularly in St. Croix, there were small streams or rivers at that particular time. St. Croix was pretty well known for the marine environment, because when the Spanish colonized the island, they did not second St. Croix. It was used as for the fishes and the natural resources for the forests. The Spanish, of course, was in Puerto Rico, so they protect the island. So because of the resources that it had, and the ecosystem and the forest. St. Croix was basically totally forest once upon a time. Next slide. Let's give you another picture of the island, the coastal area from the Green Mountain, the valleys to the hill. Literally touch the water. If you talk to the older person who lived here before us, I like talking to older people. Because they were here before we, and they give how life was back in those days in terms of hurricanes, for example, in terms of earthquake, how the landscape changed over the years, because it was basically agriculture at a particular time. Now it's mostly industry, heavy industry, and tourists, and the tourists depend upon the ecosystem. What really attracts me to the Virgin Islands is the natural and the cultural resources. Next slide. This is a mangrove, one of our mangrove ecosystem. We lost a lot of our wetland here in Virgin. More than 50% of the wetland have been lost. The largest wetland was the Croix Lagoon, where today you have one of the largest and the largest oil refinery, today they call Lime Tree. That whole area was a mangrove forest along with the backside company, which is on that side. So in early 1960s, that would destroy, and it created the industrial area. From that part, from the west, the whole South Shore have been impacted. For miles and miles, the beach have disappeared. Today you can go there and you can see houses basically going on in the ocean. With climate change and the change in the ocean, time of the tide. So the whole area is totally gone. It took over a half a century. And then on the eastern part of the refinery, it stays the last beaches, and you see the impact what took place because of a poor decision, I think, back in the 1960s to create the industrial section where the impact, the mangrove really destroyed the mangroves. So a lot of the fisheries and so forth in this part of the islands have been really impacted. And of course, recently this was in the paper talking about the lemon tree situation. Next slide. We have different kind of forests. We don't have a rainforest, even though folks talk about rainforest. You have what we call a mice forest. And so this is the mice forest here. And so the species of plant in this particular area compared to the dry forest or the basin forest is different. And forest is very important on the island in terms of rain. What the forest does when it's rain, it slows down the water, it percolates into the ground and help the streams to flow. All that have changed over the years since the forests have basically depleted, and they have invasive species plant that take over the forest. So the hydrology of the ground have changed through human, through invasive species. There's one particular plant, for example, what we call tantan, that comes from South America. The root system about 20 feet deep. So you take a lot of water from the ground. You got evaporation, transpiration, so that changed the whole underground water system because of the invasive species. But it's just a picture of our my forest here in St. Croix. Next slide. Going back to the colonial period, slaves had a lot to play in the ecosystem. And for example, they used to escape to the island. So they escaped to Puerto Rico. So they would cut the trees down and they make a canoe and then escape to Puerto Rico. And what happened? The Danish government, they passed laws not to protect trees, but to cut more trees down for these enslaved Africans don't get, the tree to cut and to migrate it to Puerto Rico or elsewhere from slavery. So this just a picture, and this individual talking about how slaves run away from St. Thomas, as well as from St. Croix and St. John, and they escape and go over to Puerto Rico. Next slide. Maroons are basically runaway slave. People that run away, they call them maroons. And they were in Jamaica. Let me go back. In Jamaica, I was there in 2019. I was there in 2010, and the maroon in Jamaica still exists. They were the individuals that fought the colonial system. And in Jamaica, they have a couple maroon society that govern themselves. But in the Voice-Not, we also have maroon and St. Croix. There's a place called in the northwest called Maroon Bore or Maroon Ridge. So these freedom fighters was very important in terms of getting emancipation that we have back in 1848. Next slide. These are some of the laws that govern the runaway slave and enslaved Africans. Denmark have the most harshest laws in the Caribbean, this part of the world. These are some of the laws, for example, if you're a runaway slave or a Negro and you're being caught, you could be branded. Or if a maroon is gone for 8 days, for example, you could be pinched or lashed 150 lashes. Or for example, if the person have a plot, they will lose the leg. They will cut off the head. By cutting off the head, once they catch the individual, they cut the head off and they put the head around the island to discourage them from escaping. But that really increased the runaway of this individual. So there were 19 codes that the Denmark had, and they just for the code that I show you that have an impact on these individuals. Next slide. Christian here was a Moravian minister that came to the islands back in the 1700s, and it was a Moravian and taught the enslaved population. And this is a picture here where the Maroon went away and they cut off his foot, for example. And he loses his foot, and it's up to the planters when they do call them, whether they punish them or whether they cut off a limb or cut off a foot. In the other picture, you see how they have the other one with a chain tie on his neck and a chain around his foot as well. So this is the kind of condition that happened over 20 years here in the Virgin Islands. Next slide. Baptiste, a French, who described in St. Croix how beautiful the island was in terms of the forest. Next slide. Here, other French spoke about the forest in St. Croix. The French owned St. Croix from 1650 until 1669. They migrated to Haiti. And then Denmark got St. Croix in 1733 by a treaty from the French, but St. Croix was on a 7th flag. And so when the French came here, it was believed that some of the forest was burned. And so when Denmark came, they saw a lot of forest still exists on the island. So they describing the forest and how the island was covered at a particular time. Next slide. One of the highest price plants was the ligament vitae that was shipped to Denmark and shipped throughout Europe. Very hard wood. The plant now today is an endangered species here in the Virgin Islands, and it's used for many medicinal uses, for example, syphilis. And this one, a price plant that was, cut down here more than 20 years ago and shipped to Europe. So before the Denmark really established agriculture in the island, they have so many forests, and the forests were cut down for so many decades before they started to cultivate. And the forests were the major thing that attract Denmark to where was the forest that remained on the islands. Next slide. They said talking about the European value, the hardwood of the islands, and the Moravian minister who was here, in one of his books, he described the forest here. The forest protect the people here in Ireland too as well. The forest pretty well. And they use the forest for medicinal purposes or for building structures. And so really was the forest that the natural resources were very important to the people. And I mentioned earlier, Denmark decided to pass a law just to cut down the forest because the slave was running away. And that have a real impact on the ecosystem. When it rained, the ocean turned red because there was no trees to hold the soil in place. So everything just washed away and end up in the ocean, which impact the marine life. Next slide. This is a newspaper. Like today, is someone in jail and a getaway. You have the social media, they describe them. During the Danish time, you see this an example where a slave on the way, they have his name and they describe the individual to capture this slave. Next slide. This is where they're hunting them and to look for this individual, and they will just cut the forest down. They will do anything trying to catch these individual. And this is the hunting party looking for the runaway slave. Next slide. This is a map of St. Croix. It was 9 quarters. You can see the lines. For example, you have the west end quarter, You got North A, North B. Then in the east, you got East A, East B. Then you have Company. Then you got Prince Quarter. So the island was divided during the Danish into 9 quarters, with the French into 6 quarters, and within those quarters, they established plantation from 150 acres over to 200 or 300 acres. So that was totally divided. Single was the fourth in the world in producing sugar during the peak of the king of the sugar in St. Croix. If you look on the south side, you see the palm red on the south side. That's a mangrove area. This map is 1767. You can see the Great Pond on the other side over here, and you can see some of the wetland around the island, including Salt River. And the west side, you see Sandy Point today, which is a natural, is a refuge, which is protected. And so this map shows you the divide of the island, and within those, they created the sugar industry. Next slide. This is the Northwest are trying to protect for more than 20 years. One of the last remaining area of the islands. And the right-hand side, there are some students from the University of Missouri, not Missouri, but the University of Minnesota. For the past 17 years, I wanted the professor to come down for about 4 weeks, and they get a grade. They're working in the community, working in the conservancy and other groups in the islands. And we went on a hiking trip, and I took them to this part of the island of St. Croix. And so this area here, we're walking right to the tip. That's Maroon Ridge, starting from over 300 feet to almost 1,000 feet, and they go right up. On that side, that's part the slave them jump off the part of the island. This part is very close to St. Thomas from this part of the island. And you can see these pools. This pool, we have around 14 pools where folks go down and swim there. One of the natural resources is a lot of wilks. Wilks is one of the delicacy here many years ago, welcome the rice for the local folks. Next slide. This side, this is the east end. Right now, I have a project right now with Native Conservancy and Coastal Zone Management. I fought to protect this area back in the 90s. Native Survey Committee, they came in and they purchased on the southern part of the island. So this whole area is protected, and the northern part of the island, it was given to the people of Waterland by Philip Dickinson. This is back in the 1970s. So the whole area is protected, but the problem is it being impacted today because people drive up on those hills and causing a lot of erosion. It's a very dry area. So right now I have a project with there where we educate the public. We have, for example, a town hall meeting probably in this month. We putting up sign explaining about the ecosystem and also about the terrestrial environment. So this one of my project working right now. And this area is the one of the most advertised on St. Croix, especially for ecotourism. This is the most eastern part of the United States. They were named after Stuart Judah, one in the Department of Interior that worked with the late Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and they named the eastern part of him after him. And outside you can see Bob Island, which is a natural monument. This area right now is protected in terms of called Eastern Marine Park. I work with that group, and it take us over 40 years before it became protected, the marine area. So now the marine area started from Chinel Bay and going to the Great Pond. And this included this area here. Next slide. This is in Felton and Christiansted, where the folks come to the market. In St. Croix, up to the 60s, were basically agriculture. There was no other industry except for agriculture. There was 3 factories remain at that time, was Bethlehem, the Richmond, Christiansted area, and then the one in Featherstone, LaGrange. What happened during the 1800s, there was, in terms of the economy, was pretty bad. So the planters and the estate decided to create central factories, and that's what they did. So they bring all the sugarcane to this factory, and there was manufactured there. traditionally, people come to the market and Saturday they stroll the Caribbean, not just St. Christ, and you can see these ladies how they dress and have the basket and have the provision. So agriculture was a major part of the St. Christ until the 60s when it changed to industry. Next slide. This in 1765, 1829, and let's talk about some of the horror that happened to people that came to this part of the island. When you talk about the natural resources, you gotta talk about the cultural resources and intertwine. And as we go along, I will show you why intertwine, because some of the natural resources was used as part of constructing buildings, here, sugar mills, and so forth. Next slide. Yeah, I'm familiar with this. So in the Virgin Islands, what we're doing when we're talking about ecosystem is very sensitive to the people here when it comes to the fish, when it comes to plants. And so even though we were trained in these areas, you know, with the environment, wherever the expertise is, but when it going to the community and talking about, you know, we use, for example, marine environment, which was involving with fishermen to create areas to be protected. So this was protected and they can't fish there for X amount of, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 years. The fisherman got upset. So you have to explain to them what exactly you're doing. But the fisherman said they are conservationists. They only take fish that they need. But what happened over the years, things have changed. You have individual, they will take everything to the ocean. So when it comes to the environment, it goes right back to the people because the people is part of the environment. And so anything that we do, we have to get the people consent and explain to them exactly what we're doing that they benefit everybody. But it's very touchy when it comes to the environment in the Virgin Islands. Whether it's cutting down a tree, or whether it's catching a fish, or whether you're putting up a building, those sort of things. So you have to, the environment and the cultural resources, is a marriage. They go hand in hand together. Next slide. This is another picture here. I've been to many public hearings over the years, all kind of public hearing, and these come right up again. In the community, they got to learn to trust you. You just don't come in and you're talking about a particular project. So you have to get the people confident and they go back to the history, what happened to them. So once you gain the confidence, then they'll be able to start to work with you. And they'll be debating in the community about a particular area. So for example, if I have a colleague came from the US and came in, you know, start to work with us, one of the first things I do, I take him out to meet the people in the community. And you know, or people in the community here, say like a farmer, for example, you go to him and you the entomologist, you're looking at his bug, and he want to tell you about his family, he want to give you coffee, he want to know more about you. So if you just go down and look at the bug and then come to the office, that's a really good relationship. So you have to gain the confidence. So when you go to these people, they want to tell you about their family, you know what's going on, they want to know about you. So once you gain that, then they begin to trust you. But if you do not do that, it'll be very difficult to convince them, explain to them exactly what you're trying to do when it comes to the environment. Next slide. I mentioned this early. You can see the heads that drawing people here in the Virgin Islands and throughout the Caribbean. So again, the environment and the cultural resources in hand. You cannot separate the natural resources from the people. You cannot separate that from the culture. They intertwine. So we deal with the climate change you gotta get something tangible. When you talk about climate change, they don't know what you're talking about. So for a good example, you take them out on the field trips and show them what's taking place. You took pictures, do documentation, and then they begin to understand what exactly we're talking about. But if you talk about climate change, they have no idea what you're talking about. Because we have more hurricane, but if you go back to the history of the islands, from, for example, back in 1526, we have information from 1526 coming right down to the present. and show them that the hurricane we had back in 2020, that was the first time that we have 2 hurricanes back to back. I could go back and show you what happened during in the 16 and the 17, where we have 2 and 3 hurricanes. A good example, the last hurricane I hit the Virgin Islands, before the hurricane we have now, Hurricane Hugo. The one I hit the Virgin Islands was 1928. My grandmother born during the Danish time. And next hurricane I hit the island, impact was Hugo, that over 60 years. They have a generation of people have no idea. My mom, she's still alive, she's 87, and she not really saw hurricane until Hugo. They have hurricane that came close to the island, but now it impact the islands. So that's the difference. So what happened? The lifestyle changed. Hurricane shutters begin to disappear because they didn't see any hurricane. But before that time, people go from way back, they know about hurricane. So guess what happened? The buildings and what's not were built in such a way to withstand hurricane shutouts. The Danish have coding for buildings. And so we get slack over the years. And when Hurricane Hugo came now, everything changed. So that's why history plays an important part of in terms of protecting the environment. Next slide. This is a forest, a quote, one in the book was written by a Dane. And you can see here, it talk about the interest was in the forest, the hardwood forest and St. Croix. And the last tree was useful for construction, for building ship, canoe, charcoal, machinery. So a lot of the sugar mills and St. Croix, with the whole island particularly, have woods and what's not. We have over 300 sugar mills on the island. And St. Croix about 54 or 53,400 acres. 30 acres of island sugar cane, totally, basically entire island sugar cane. They come on the island, you see historical structures all over. I mean, it was really maxed out when it comes to sugar production. So this quote here was back in 1733 with this Danish, and St. Croix was very attracted. Even when it was dry, the fire was still green. Today, it's totally opposite. Next slide. This is here, they cut down the trees. And once you cut down the trees, you get a lot of soil erosion that taking place, cutting the trees to in the plant sugarcane, but they did not created what we call bomb. It's called the forest down. They put bombs, so as it rains, they will collect the soil from washing into the ocean. So they just cut trees down. As it rains, it takes the topsoil to the ocean. Next slide. This slide here, I show you it is the historical buildings in the Virgin were built from coral. Where the coral come from? The ocean. So the slave will go in the ocean and cut the corals, and they bring it back in along with sedimentary rock and begin to construct a lot of the historical building today, not just in the Virgin but throughout the Caribbean. You will see coral in buildings. So the environment, the marine environment was impacted. And there's just an example here where you see the coral, you see sedimentary rock, you see a yellow brick and the red, those came from Denmark, and the boat and the ballast. And there's an example, you cannot separate the cultural and the environment. Next slide. This is a lime kiln. So what they do, they collect the coral from the ocean, because they were the best quality. And then they add shells, molasses, and water, and that was the inferior matter. And they began to construct building we call today historical building. And now St. Croix, for example, is not volcanic, but indirectly impact by volcanic activity. St. Croix, for example, is basically coral. St. Thomas and St. Croix, St. Thomas and St. John, excuse me, is volcanic, but not St. Croix, a totally opposite. So if you come at St. Croix and the driving starting part, you will see this what we call caliche or white stuff. That's basically the ocean that push up from the ocean floor. So Denmark used it for building. So around St. Croix, it totally covered with reef. We have around 8 different kind of reef on St. Croix alone. And so they use that to construct and to build. And it's a lime kiln here. And you can see how they burn it and then they construct this building. Why interesting, what the molasses does during hot or cool weather, it contracts. And so that's why these buildings still standing today, because the molasses within this inferior matter along with the lime. Next slide. This basically talking about what Denmark, what were their main purpose. And I mentioned here, Denmark became the richest on the backs of enslaved population and destruction of the island forests and marine environment. So Denmark and other colonization of the St. Croix impact the Virgin Islands going a couple hundred years ago. And I say here, however, the greatest impact is on those who are the descendants of those brutal enslaved. In many ways, the people of the Virgin Islands know very little of themselves other than they are descendants of slave, enslaved, free blacks, and maroon. I will go a step further by saying that true history of the Danish West Indies had never been told to the people of Denmark. Therefore, they remain ignorant to the brutal slave system that was once managed by the Danish administration, and they remain ignorant to the true source of Denmark wealth today. Next slide. This sugar mill is the highest in St. Croix, almost 1,000 feet, backed in mill. From up here, you have a panoramic view. This sugar mill was built in 1808, still standing. And you can see how it's taken over by nature. And with any sugar mill, it had coral from the ocean. And it had a sedimentary rock. And this was a major plantation in the northern part of St. Croix. Any question after we all give a presentation? You have any question? It's just a brief history of the island because of my time. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Davis. That was we learned a lot, and appreciate your insights. We have just a few minutes for questions. I'd like to open it up to participants, see if they have anything for Professor Davis. Just either turn your screen on, raise your hand, or use the little, you can also, there's a raise hand function that you can do through the reaction bar down at the bottom of your screen. So let me jump in then. It's clear, of the legacy both of Denmark and the United States, as far as the treatment of, the descendants of slaves or what have you. So as we look to today, you mentioned right at the end that a lot of people don't know their history, and that unfortunately leads to perhaps bad decisions or poor choices or just a lack of self-awareness. But when you think about the ecosystem services that St. Croix provides today, which, from your standpoint, because you've led tours and you've taken a lot of folks out and you know the communities, from your point of view, which ones do you think are most important? I mean, is it the ones that lead to quality of life, quiet, serene places? Or is it, the fisheries, or is it, ecotourism? What stands out to you today as we transition into the modern, we are in the modern world?
It's a balance between both of them. They want a quality of life. They want I would say, natural resources protected. But at the same time, modernization is very important. So they must have a balance. Because you can have, like one would tell me, you can have all the money, but if you don't have quality of life, it's really impact the community. For example, on St. Croix, they will say, we don't want to be like St. Thomas. And I ask, look, why? Because to St. Thomas, to them, it's overdeveloped. So at St. Croix alone, they have a different perspective compared to St. Thomas, for example. So they want to have the industries, but at the same time, they want people to be protected. They want to still go fishing and pass on to the other generations. But they just want a quality of life. They want to have a balance between the environment at the same time and the lifestyle.
Okay, well, we have in the chat room space, Makedo Okolo asks, in your research, Dr. Davis, have you come across any approaches to land or marine conservation that we should probably, think about or use today? So looking historically, what people might have done, how does that cascade to what needs to be done today? In olden days, conservation was different. The fishermen in those days, they were conservationists. They knew when they talked to a man who was 90 years old that he caught the larger fish and little smaller fish back into the ocean. Today, the fisherman, for example, they got fishermen and they got fishermen. Those that just catch fish, they catch everything. And they don't really care about, what happened tomorrow. And then they had those fishermen. And so it's a tradition, because they will tell you that's how they survive for hundreds of years on the island, by protecting the marine environment and fishing. But today now, you have a whole different way of fishing by spear, using Clorox to catch lobster, for example. And what happened, because the importation of people coming to the island, it changed the way of people doing things. Like, for example, here in St. Croix, they will use a box to catch crab, for example. Today now, people use PVC pipe, and that's a tradition that came from some place. So sometimes people that come into the island, they change the way how people do things there. And that have an impact on the entire community. All right. Well, I'm hoping you can stay for the duration.
Yeah, I will stay for the whole thing.
All right, good, because I think there'll be other opportunities to bring you back in, either to answer questions or what have you. But I think we need to try and stay on task. And I see more questions that I think are relevant, but let's hold off on those and then transition to our colleagues from the Heart Institute. I believe they're going to, like I said, provide a context between ecosystem services and hazard mitigation. And I believe our first speaker is Dr. David Yoskowitz.
Good morning. I'm David Yoskowitz. I'm the Senior Executive Director of the Heart Research Institute and Endowed Chair for Socioeconomics at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. Looking forward this morning to talking to you about planning for a resilient USVI and the role that ecosystem services can play. So one thing that we do know is that change is constant, and especially around climate change. Many of us in our own lifetimes have seen significant change with the results of changing water cycles, intensity of storms, etc. This animation over the last 100 years or so shows the change in average temperature during that time period. As is demonstrated here, the warmer the bars, the greater amount over the average temperatures. And so you can see in that last 100 years that we are having higher temperature averages than earlier on. And this is no surprise to any of us. But the results of that increase in temperature and the frequency of that increase in temperature is creating this new normal. So that in the extreme heat events are more frequent, and we all have experienced this. That has the tendency to drive other hazards. So a warming climate happens to increase in some areas, rainfall, given change in weather patterns. And so what we've seen over the last 50 years or so, as demonstrated by this meteorological data from a number of different sources as increasing temperature has seen an increase in the rise of the number of floods. Now, I must caution here that this isn't accounting also for the number or the increase in population that has found itself in more flood-prone areas. But we also see an increase of extreme weather beyond just flooding. Okay? More intensive storms, obviously more intensive flooding, and more significant droughts. That the average that we all used to talk about is really now just the point between two extremes, where we go from extreme drought to extreme wet or flood conditions. And those have really significant impacts in that the increase in population, along with the increase in hazards, whether it be flood, storm, wind damage, drought, tornadoes, etc. Now we are putting more humans in harm's way. And so you can see since 1980 here on this bar graph that we find ourselves in increasing economic risk because of the way we build and where we build with increasing populations. And so on this graphic, and provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, these billion-dollar disasters have increased in frequency as time has gone on. And in 2020, around the world, this has had significant impact on individuals and communities and cities in terms of displacing individuals as a result of natural disasters. And in 2020, it was estimated that over 30 million people were displaced because of natural disasters, 14 million of that from flooding and 32,000 from drought. In the United States alone, including the U.S. Virgin Islands, 1.7 million individuals were displaced because of natural disasters. So what can we take away from this and be thinking about our connection to the natural environment, to natural habitats, and how they might be able to mitigate and create resilience? So hazard mitigation, in the definition that we want to use here, is the process of taking measures to minimize and potentially eliminate the impact of hazards on communities, infrastructure, and natural resources. Whereas resilience is the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and to withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. So how can we begin to mitigate impacts from flooding, extreme storm events, drought, etc.? Well, one of the things we can begin to think about is how we connect the natural environment to the human environment and the role that the natural environment plays for mitigation and resilience. So ecosystem services have been defined in many ways, but it most basically is that direct and indirect contributions from the natural environment or from ecosystems that help support, sustain, and enrich human life. And typically we have had divided up ecosystem services in four really major categories. So the cultural services, what we call provisioning services, such as food, fiber, the regulating services, and these are the services that are provided that help regulate Earth system processes that are really important to you and I as human beings. A big thing might be such as carbon sequestration or the lack of it, unfortunately. Also nutrient cycling, etc. And then support services that are things such as pollination. That's extremely important in, for example, crop production. So those are those direct and indirect values that we get from the natural environment. And then we have a whole other category that I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but a little bit more technical in terms of how we think about this as economists, are these non-use or passive use values. And so things that just the existence of the ecosystem in a pristine state is really important. And we want that to be around to be able to have our children and grandchildren enjoy that. So that's a bequest value that we get from a pristine natural environment. So really, if you think about ecosystem services can happen really anywhere that there's this interaction and this benefit that between the natural environment and human well-beings. And so ecosystem services are really demand driven. And what I mean by that is that you could have always the potential supply from the natural environment to provide these benefits, but they have to be demanded for the actual service to take place or to occur. As I said, they can occur on the landward side or the seaward side and in the margins in between. As I mentioned earlier, some examples of ecosystem services are nutrient processing for supportive service, primary reduction, hydrological cycle, regulating services, a lot of the processes that can control ecosystems, provisioning services, raw material, and the cultural services, which a lot of us are very familiar with, but are very difficult to maybe value, are things such as recreation, aesthetics, science and education, and cultural, spiritual, and historic significance. But demonstrating the value can be challenging. It can be done in monetary terms, right? Dollar, pounds, gold, bullion, whatever makes sense. But we can also value the benefits from our natural environment in non-monetary terms, such as just easy ranking. Does it make us feel good? Does it make us feel bad? Whatever it may be. So I think the point here is that value can be demonstrated in many different ways, and the way that you demonstrate that value should be the most appropriate for what you're trying to achieve. Right? So if we look at the U.S. Virgin Islands from the ridge to the reef, and this is something that I've worked on in trying to, how do we connect that natural environment to those constituents of well-being that emanate from ecosystem services? And so we take the habitats themselves. So in the U.S. Virgin Islands, let's think about this in terms of a ridge to reef and all the habitats that are in between there. And so those habitats have this biophysical functioning, right? What they do, whether it be, the forests, the mangroves, the reefs, et cetera, they function in a certain way. But as part of a bigger system, there's this ecological functioning that takes place with the other habitats or species around it, such as creating a spawning nursery, nutrient cycling, that interaction between abiotic and biotic, gas exchange, et cetera. And it's that ecological function that then leads into the many different ecosystem services that we talked about before. And it's the experience of those benefits or those ecosystem services that then creates this well-being in us as individuals or communities. And so it's a well-functioning ecosystem that provides these benefits that leads to things such as this personal security, material being that, livelihoods and food and shelter, the health aspects, the social relations, etc. So the benefits from the natural environment, which we call ecosystem services, are those things that affect our well-being eventually. And so in the Virgin Islands, as well as elsewhere around the world, we've seen some significant changes since, in just the last couple of decades, right? Big part of this is land use changes. And those changes have then affected the habitats, which then have affected the provision of ecosystem services that could potentially, in what we're talking about today, have mitigating factors against the hazards that are a result of climate change, and therefore can lead potentially to less resilience. And so being able to demonstrate and talk about the benefits connected to the natural environment, the services that we get from that, within this frame of hazard mitigation and resilience is critical in helping us to make decisions about what we need to protect, restore, conserve for hazard mitigation and resilience. And then in the world that we live in, which is of scarce resources, right? We have to be able to make some decisions about trade-offs. And so being able to identify those benefits or services that are most important for certain types of mitigation, ecosystem services helps us in that. And we'll be talking a lot about that today.
All right, well, thank you, David. Sorry, I'm blanking out on who our next speaker is. Maybe Chris.
Dijani is up next.
All right, so we're next to hear from Dijani Laplace. He's actually a recent graduate of the University of Virgin Islands, and he worked with us here at the Hazard Mitigation Project as an intern last year, and then most recently he has been employed by Texas A&M. So I'll turn it over to Dijani now. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dijani Laplace. I'm a research assistant at the Hart Research Institute at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. And today I'll be giving a brief overview of some of the major habitats on St. Croix and some of the ecosystem services that they provide. But first, let's look at the land use maps already depicted on your screen. On the left, we have a land use map of St. Croix from 1985. And on the right, we have a land use map of St. Croix from 2018. So initially, you can tell that the farmland depicted in the yellow color has decreased on St. Croix in this period of time, but it still makes up a significant portion of the land use. Additionally, the forest area is mostly limited to the northwestern corner of the island. That is mostly more hilly in relation to the rest of the island that is of lower elevation. And of course, the forest here being in the green color. And of course, there's been a significant uptick in development in two areas, specifically the two city centers on island. So the first being the Christiansted area here. And then the Frederiksted area here. Our development here is depicted in three varying levels, pink being low intensity, red being medium intensity, and then dark red being high intensity. So high intensity development can be seen around the area of the refinery here, that's pretty dark red. There's also been significant development just above the refinery in the Lime Tree, Scion Hill, Bon Esperance, and Allendale areas. Now this is just a time lapse showing the same land use map, but now showing 4 time periods from 1985 to 2018, so 1985 and 1992, and 2004 and 2018. And if you look at our focus areas again, Christiansted and Frederiksted, you can see they go from low intensity development in 1985, progressing slowly to medium, and then some high intensity development in 2018. So the first habitat that I'll be speaking about today are forests. Now forests in the USVI are mostly subtropical dry and subtropical moist forests. St. Croix's forest cover is about 54% of the island, and the forest acreage is 26,179 acres. Now, forests on territory provide a variety of ecosystem services, some being they sequester carbon by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and then incorporating it into their biomass through various processes. And this helps mitigate some of the effects of climate change that we contribute to through our daily activities of producing CO2. They also prevent soil erosion by trapping soil in between their roots, and this also helps to prevent sediment runoff as well. Forests are also a major habitat for many of the terrestrial animals that we have on territory, such as birds, bats, some mammals, some reptiles, some amphibians like frogs, and of course, insects. Now, this is a land use map. This is just a forest map, rather, from using 2018 data, just showing the extent of the forest here on island, in relation to the development that's on island and some of the developed open space seen in the light green color here, that's on island, and as well as the roadways.
Did we lose Dijani, or?
You can see up in the Northwest Corridor, there's some roads that cut through the hillier part of St. Croix and fragment some of the forest there, and allow the other forest area and the urban forests that occur are fragmented all between these urban areas that go across the center of the island.
Back in wildlife, especially the hassling of sitoracles, the endangered species, leatherback greens, so impacting those, impacting fishermen in time of the boat getting caught up, you know, in the series, and then it also impacting pleasure boat, for example, those that are going to Island. So it do impacting the environment along with people everyday life, those who in water sport, impacting the beaches that people that swim. So definitely, yeah.
Right.
That cut through the hillier part of St. Croix and fragment some of the forest there, and allow the other forested area and the urban forests that occur are fragmented all between these urban areas that go across the center of the island and then over to the east end. So this forest fragmentation that we experience from all this urbanization has decreased the quality of the forest on St. Croix in general. And by decreasing the quality of the forest on the island, we therefore decrease the ecosystem services that they provide. So a closely related habitat to forests on St. Croix are guts. Now, guts have been historically used as a water source for domestic, agricultural, and industrial purposes. Now, St. Croix was historically used as a massive place for sugar production in the 19th and 20th century. So a lot of these guts may have provided fresh water for the planting of the cane crop, which was king at the time. They also provide food and a habitat for some of the organisms that live in these guts, that are around some of the urban areas on island. They also provide recreational opportunities such as hiking and nature walks. They also influence the placement of buildings historically, since naturally you would want to build your home in the past near close to a fresh source of water, and they still influence them now, since the VI code dictates that any development has to occur at least 30 feet from the center of a water course, this case being a gut, or 25 feet from the gut's edge. Guts are also used as a living laboratory for research and science and education. So here on the left, this is a map showing some of the guts, well, most of the major guts here on St. Croix. Now the guts being the blue lines, the roadways, of course, being yellow again, the Waste Management Authority bin sites being these dark gray circles here and here. And then these road gut intersections, which are these blue and white diamonds that are going along many of the guts. And then the riverine flood zones that are associated with these guts are in gray. So there's not a lot of waste. There wasn't a lot of waste management bin sites near these guts that are occurring and along these gut intersections. But I remember that there was a lot of farmland from the land use data that we saw previously. So instead, I decided to overlay it by looking at the center of the island that had a lot of these road gut intersections and then overlay it with the farmland. So you can see here the farmland depicted in yellow is just dispersed across the center of the island, and a lot of this farmland overlaps with a lot of the road gut intersections that we have. Now, because of this close proximity to the farmland and these road gut intersections, the potential for runoff and agricultural runoff to get into these guts is high. And then it could decrease the quality of these guts by putting in certain chemicals and pollutants. And then these guts may transfer these pollutants all the way to the marine ecosystems and damage them as well. So moving further towards the coast, we'll now be looking at wetlands. So wetlands in this instance being salt ponds, salt flats, mangroves, and freshwater ponds. These wetlands provide a variety of ecosystem services on St. Croix and in the greater territory. Mangroves help to trap sediment and build up the shoreline and beaches by keeping sediment in between their prop roots. Salt ponds and freshwater ponds and salt flats can help to trap and filter runoff and pollutants, but runoff that contains pollutants and sediment. And this is especially important in St. Croix where there's a lot of farming activity. And it also happens at Great Pond, where there's a lot of grazing and farming activity that happens right above the pond that connects really close to shore. Mangroves also help to reduce wave energy and mitigate the impact of storm surge from storms. Trees that are associated with these wetlands and mangroves as well help to sequester carbon and mitigate the effects of climate change. And wetlands just have been historically and culturally significant around the territory, and have some wetlands, such as freshwater ponds, have been major sources of water for local farmers. So this map depicts St. Croix wetlands. So wetlands here being the cyan color. So you can see there's some wetlands here down at the Sandy Point area below Frederickstead. There's some Croix Lagoon is here, located near the refinery area. Then there's some wetlands here, again, up by the Salt River Historic Park. And then there's Altala Lagoon near Christiansted, Southgate Pond, and then Great Pond down here. Now, a lot of the wetlands in the territory were significantly impacted by the storms in 2017. And using a SLOSH model, that is the sea, lake, and overland impacts from storm surge from hurricanes model produced by the National Weather Service, we can see how a hypothetical Category 4 hurricane would affect these wetlands that we have in the territory. So wetlands again being in cyan, and then this is the varying levels of storm surge. So the blue being up to 3 feet above ground, yellow being greater than 3 feet above ground, the orange being greater than 6 feet above ground, and the red being greater than 9 feet above ground. So the wetlands depicted here on the left on the left image are Altona Lagoon here, and then Southgate Pond here. So we can see that Southgate Pond would hypothetically experience greater than 3 feet of storm surge from a hypothetical Category 4 storm. Some areas of Altona Lagoon would also experience this as well. Now, if we look over to the right image, we have Great Pond. So Great Pond would be significantly impacted from a hypothetical Category 4 storm because it would experience up to greater than 6 feet storm surge inundation from that storm. So we can see why if a hypothetical storm could do this much damage if a hypothetical Category 4 storm could do this much damage to our wetlands, we can see why the actual storms that we experienced in 2017 that were Cat 5s did a lot of damage to our wetlands. Moving now into our marine systems, we'll focus on coral reefs. So coral reefs provide a variety of ecosystem services, some being just their sheer economic value to the territory. Coral reefs support high biodiversity, and a lot of fish use them as foraging spots, spawning spots for their eggs, and then nurseries for their juvenile fish. And this helps to support the fishing industry. And also, It's aesthetically pleasing to watch all these biodiverse habitats that are associated with coral, and that helps bring in tourism. And tourists helps make coral reefs a tourist attraction. Coral reefs also provide coastal protection by buffering against the effects of wave action and breaking up waves before they come all the way onto shore and erode some of our beaches. They also have historical and cultural value to the people of the US Virgin Islands that have been using these reefs for a very long time. And they still provide recreational opportunities to locals such as snorkeling and diving. So the map that we see here depicts just the extent of coral cover on St. Croix. Coral cover here being the purple color. So you can see there's a lot of coral occurring on the southern shore of the island and around the Buck Island Reef Monument up here, and then on the northeastern end of St. Croix. So coral in the territory has experienced a lot of anthropogenic stress by us from humans, and one of those is land runoff. So the exposure to runoff in St. Croix is seen here, with the high value being the orange color, and then the bluer color being the low exposure value. You can see that the area near to the refinery has some high land runoff exposure due to it being an impervious surface, and also below the airport here also has some high land runoff exposure. So if we could help to at least mitigate some of this land runoff that we have in some of these areas at Christiansted as well, we could help at least relieve some of the anthropogenic stress that we put on coral reefs that are already stressed by thermal stress from climate change and also from disease.
All right, thank you, Dijani. We're going to hold off on questions until we get through the last speaker here. Our next speaker is Christopher McDonald. He too is a recent graduate from the University of Virgin Islands. He is working with the team here in St. Thomas for the hazard mitigation and resilience planning effort. And so without further ado, Christopher.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher McDonald, and today I'll be talking to you about the agriculture system in the US Virgin Islands. Well, agriculture system, like Mr. Olasee Davis presented, he provided a great overview of the history of agriculture. Today, agriculture definitely has developed over time and is it supports the USVI economy. Agriculture, as you know it, we see it everywhere, especially on Saturdays at our local farmers market, such as the pictures that you see below. And agriculture also allows the development of food security and soil quality as well. So the USVI economy for the farmers market, if you see in the photos below, you realize that the farmers are able to sell field crops, vegetables, and crops that are grown from local fruit trees. These crops include vegetables such as cabbage, carrots, celery, cucumbers, eggplant, lettuce. You have cassava. You have field crops such as potatoes. And you also have crops from fruit trees such as avocados. You have pineapples, coconuts, bananas, etc. In the agriculture system, especially in the farmers market, not only do farmers have the opportunity to sell crops, but they sell a variety of different things. If you notice in the first image, you see that you have the opportunity to purchase different seeds, different plants, as well as hot sauce that's depicted in the first image. In the second one, you also have the opportunity to purchase a variety of plants which local farmers sell. Not only with the crops, you also have the opportunity for agriculture and the agriculture in the USVI to have livestock. And these livestock consist of cattle, pigs, sheep, lambs, goats, chicken, turkey, and ducks. The image that you see in the photo is an example of the livestock that we have here in the US Virgin Islands, as well as the different habitat that they're currently in. To give you an idea of the US Virgin Islands, this study was done by the United States Department of Agriculture, and they were able to do a soil survey which identified prime farmland. Prime farmland is a term that is used to best observe the different areas that are known to have the best nutrients for growing crops. In the photo that you see, we have depicted the US Virgin Islands, and the areas that you notice in St. Thomas, St. John, and in St. Croix are shown with prime farmland. I have highlighted these specific areas. For St. Thomas, you see a variety throughout the island, vice versa in St. John. And then you notice in St. Croix that there is a lot of prime farmland. But one of the things that we wanted to compare prime farmland with is development. And in the previous presentation that Dijani showed, we noticed that development has definitely increased over time. And in the photo that you see right here with the prime farmland, we zoomed in on St. Croix specifically, and we highlighted the areas that you see with the red arrows pointing on the different areas in St. Croix that has the prime farmland. In the next slides that you see, we compared the prime farmland with development. And the development was from 1985, 1992, 2004, and 2018. As you noticed in 1985, that areas have been developed in St. Thomas, St. John, and in St. Croix. In 1992, a few years later, we noticed that the prime farmland in St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix has definitely developed. And we also noticed that specifically in St. Thomas, that parts of the northern southern side of St. Thomas have definitely developed. And in St. John, we noticed that Cruz Bay has definitely developed. And then we noticed in St. Croix, we see that the northern side specifically has developed when it comes to prime farmland, which you notice in these arrows depicted here. In 2004, as we move on over the course of years, we noticed that the prime farmland, specifically in St. Croix, has definitely developed. Those areas that were in 1992, such as the arrows pointed here, have definitely developed from prime farmland into development, and vice versa for St. Thomas and St. John. And then our last image here with the 2018 data, we noticed that prime farmland has definitely increased in St. Thomas, where a majority of the development has enhanced the prime farmland areas, vice versa for St. John. But we noticed that over the course of time, specifically for St. Croix, we see that as the years went by, the development has increased throughout the whole island of St. Croix, versus that there's still prime farmland according to the 2018 data. So in summary of this presentation, we wanted to really highlight that agriculture is reliant on ecosystem services, especially since it provides food in the US Virgin Islands. One of the things that we also wanted to highlight is that the soil survey based on the United States Department of Agriculture really enforces the opportunity for individuals to learn which areas are prime farmland. In other words, which areas are best known to have the best growing for a variety of crops. But also when it comes to agriculture, it provides research opportunities such as what you've seen in the previous slides about the soil survey, as well as development, the impacts of development on agriculture. And one of the things that we also wanted to highlight is that over time, development is being conducted on prime farmland soil. So this brings the conversation of different management and future practices decisions on preserving the remainder of the prime farmland soil. And last but not least, the soil survey that was conducted by the United States Department of Agriculture is used for specifically farming and local planning decisions. So this concludes the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to contact me at any time.
Well, thank you, Christopher. Yeah, I think it's a little depressing to see such prime real estate or prime agriculture estate get developed. And this points back to, the need to have a comprehensive land and water use plan for the territory, because I think, ultimately, we should have the option. If we have farmers, they should have options to pursue opportunities like that. And we pretty much lost it here in St. Thomas, and I think St. Croix is definitely the place to consider those decisions and those trade-offs. So it is 10:43. We are 13 minutes behind schedule, in part because of the technical difficulties. I apologize for that. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back at 10:48 and pick it up with our discussion on Great Pond and Cane Bay trade-offs. All right, our 5 minutes, which seems like a blink of an eye, but we are back. And now I'd like to introduce Chris Hale, who is also an alum from the University of the Virgin Islands. She was our first graduate from the Master's in Marine and Environmental Studies program a little over a decade ago. And so excited to be tracking her development, professional development, and seeing what she's doing today. But I'll turn it over to her as she leads this discussion on the trade-off exercises.
Welcome back from the break, everyone. So far this morning, we have discussed that given land use changes over time, as well as climate change impacts, ecosystem services are changing too. Therefore, the well-being benefits that we receive from the ridge reef ecosystem are changing as well. I'd like to dive in a little deeper on well-being and, using examples, relate mitigation activities to well-being and how we can navigate decision-making related to changing ecosystems. So how could USVI communities deal with these changes? We know we can take preparedness measures like installing disaster warning systems, purchasing radio communications equipment, or perhaps participating in emergency response and recovery training. But preparedness is different from mitigation. Mitigation is the process of taking action to minimize and potentially eliminate the impact of hazards on communities, infrastructure, and natural resources. Now, there are many different hazard mitigation approaches that an individual and community can take. And if you're like me, you can easily get lost down a rabbit hole when learning about all the mitigation options at our disposal. Thankfully, FEMA has made it easier on us by grouping mitigation actions into these 4 general categories, seen here as local planning and regulations, structure and infrastructure projects, natural systems protection, and education and awareness programs. I'd like to be clear that I am not a hazard mitigation expert. In fact, we may have some of those experts in our workshop today, but I point you to these as examples of general actions that affect ecosystems and ecosystem services. Given our theme for today's workshop, I especially want to focus on actions or management decisions concerning natural systems. This will help us understand the relationship between our actions concerning the VI environment and well-being outcomes in terms of resilience. We'll do this by thinking about trade-offs and synergies. So in general, the term trade-off involves losing one quality or aspect of something in return for gaining another quality or aspect. But in terms of ecosystem services, a trade-off is a situation where the use of one ecosystem service directly decreases the benefits supplied by another. A trade-off could occur in the same place or in a different place. For example, the impact of the management of an upland forest on local recreation, as well as on downstream water quality. There are also trade-offs between the present and future use of an ecosystem service. For example, overharvesting a fish stock now will have ramifications in the future. In contrast, a synergy is a situation where the use of one ecosystem service directly increases the benefits supplied by another service. For example, the protection of coral reef areas impacts fish abundance, which increases algal grazing and thus protects the coral, which eventually enhances recreation opportunities. So given all of the potential trade-offs and synergies, how do we manage our natural resources so that we are maximizing the benefits we receive? What are the trade-offs and where can we synergize? Well, one way we can consider our many options is by utilizing a framework such as the Ecosystem Service Logic Model Framework. These models represent the way a management action cascades through an ecological system and results in ecosystem services and human well-being impacts. Logic models are a great tool to compare strategies across locations to match likely outcomes with stakeholder goals. Additionally, evidence that accompanies these models can be used to clarify uncertainties that need to be considered and to identify critical research gaps. If standardized, these models can provide a consistent platform for multiple hazard mitigation approaches and help increase monitoring efficiency. We are presenting this framework to you today as one of many decision-making approaches, and although the logic model development can get complex rather quickly, we're using it today to demonstrate the many well-being outcomes, or more specifically, the socioeconomic outcomes that can result when a community places the local ecosystem at the heart of the decision-making process. So let's start by talking about outcomes. Through research and application, we know that some outcomes of restoration are directly associated with resilience. For example, increased economic activity in a particular community through jobs, labor, and income allow that community to be more resilient to external shocks that harm the economy. Additionally, when people in the community are employed, they enjoy greater levels of economic resilience and are able to respond better to unexpected shocks. Also, diverse job markets are known to be more resilient because the community does not depend on just one single industry. In terms of costs, damage to property is a direct reflection of structural resilience, and repair costs for property damage similarly link to the property owner's economic resilience. As far as expenditures goes, increased spending at businesses in a particular community allow that community to be more resilient to external shocks. If spending takes place outside of the target community, then this may not affect local resilience. The ability for shoreline property to withstand external stressors like flooding and erosion represents a facet of structural resilience. Increases in property value can be linked to an individual's household's economic resilience, and at a larger scale, increases in a community's property values, which can be linked to economic resilience at the community level. Community members' health and associated capabilities are essential to resilience. A healthy community is better able to respond to and cope with external shocks. Additionally, when community members gain increased knowledge and understanding of their environment in the context of threats to resilience, this can help spur increased public support for future similar restoration projects that would add to resilience. Strengthened or maintained cultural values can be linked to community ties and increased social capital, which in turn leads to increased social resilience. Critical facilities, for example, hospitals, schools, or government buildings, are important for a community's ability to respond to hazardous events. Therefore, changes in their closure rate or social disruption can impact a community's resilience. Again, each of these are specific outcomes that result from making changes to an ecosystem, such as restoration, but not limited to restoration, that are associated with resilience. I'm going to show you on our next slide where some of these outcomes relate to hazard mitigation using a logic model. So here is one example of a fully developed ecosystem service logic model that my team developed with partners for a previous project. I know it looks like a tangled and chaotic mess, but don't worry too much about what each of those boxes says right now. I just want to point out its main ideas. We'll break it down into simpler, more digestible logic chains using some local examples in just a minute. So what are we looking at? This model shows a management action or intervention on the left in the dark blue box. In this case, the action is salt marsh restoration, which is one example of a natural systems approach to hazard mitigation. The arrows connect that action to the many effects it has on different components of the ecological system, seen here as gray boxes. These are then connected by additional lines to the human activity outcomes of that activity, seen as light blue boxes. Those human activities then result in socioeconomic outcomes, seen on the right as yellow boxes. It is important to note that these ecosystem service logic models have been validated by peer-reviewed science, as well as by consultations with experts in their respective fields. So using local St. Croix areas as examples, I'm going to pull a few threads from this crazy mess of a model to help set us up for a discussion later. We will consider Great Pond as our first example location. I'm not going to spend too much time describing this location, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But just in case we have some folks joining us from other places, I have a brief description I've pulled from feedback we collected from local subject matter experts, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Great Pond is one of the largest salt ponds in the territory, and in normal conditions has red, black, and white mangroves, and hosts a variety of resident and migratory birds. The mangroves also serve as a nursery to a variety of juvenile fish. It is one of 18 areas of particular concern that were established in 1991 by the territory. Mangroves here aren't in very good condition at the moment. They were dying from high salinity just before the 2017 hurricanes and suffer from drought-induced mortality. The pond also routinely faces issues from sedimentation, especially from storms. The fish biodiversity has decreased, and the dominant fish species in the pond became tilapia in the 90s, though current research taking place to identify shifts in fish species composition potentially resulting from the 2017 hurricanes is taking place. Great Pond is also under threat from sea level rise. It is part of the federal coastal barrier resources system, which prohibits federal funding and insurance for development in these designated areas. The Coastal Barrier Resources Act encourages the conservation of hurricane-prone, biologically rich coastal barriers by restricting federal expenditures that encourage development, such as federal flood insurance. Areas within the system can be developed provided that private developers or other non-federal parties bear the full cost. A proposition to build a gaming casino in the vicinity of the pond has been a local issue for at least a decade. So, using Great Pond as an example, we can imagine that salt pond restoration might be a desirable option for the local community that values this ecologically important area. Given that, let's explore potential outcomes that could result from salt pond restoration. You can see here that dark blue box represents the management action, salt pond restoration. And this type of restoration could involve a variety of techniques, such as replanting mangroves, as well as addressing hydrology issues that affect salinity levels. But for the sake of ease, we'll simply call it salt pond restoration. You'll see now that the gray intermediate component boxes appear. Again, these represent changes in the ecological and biophysical components of the system. In this case, when Great Pond is restored, you would expect that the salt pond quality improves and that the hydrology of the system stabilizes. And as the mangroves grow back, wave and storm surge energy is likely buffered, which affects flooding and erosion. In other words, the ecosystem services associated with a restored and healthy Great Pond begin to take effect. As Great Pond begins to thrive again, locals and tourists return to the area to recreate, which is represented here by the light blue box, the human activity component of the system. And finally, as recreational activities take place, the socioeconomic outcomes can be realized. Specifically, the outcomes from this single logic chain are property protection and social disruption. Again, that's the yellow. So what does that mean? Well, if you remember from earlier, The ability for shoreline property to withstand external stressors like flooding and erosion represents one facet of structural resilience. Additionally, in terms of social disruption, critical facilities that are important for a community's ability to respond to hazards are protected by this restored coastal barrier. So let's take a look at another chain to see if any other resilience outcomes can result from restoring Great Pond. Let's consider cultural values as an outcome. It appears that when the salt pond quality improves, so do wildlife populations, which in turn impacts wildlife viewing and bird watching, which is important in terms of local and traditional knowledge, existence value, sense of place, and other spiritual or heritage-related aspects of Crucian culture. So we know that when community members gain increased knowledge and understanding of their environment within the context of threats to resilience, this can help spur increased public support for additional restoration activities. And again, this is linked directly to social resilience. So, zooming back out to the messy yet full version of an ecosystem service logic model, we can see that the examples I walk through are but a few chains among a complex and interacting system of ecosystem changes, as well as changes in ecosystem services and in human activities, all of which influence a variety of socioeconomic outcomes. Again, I must stress that these linkages, represented in the model by lines or arrows, are not arbitrary. These linkages within the system are based in the literature and in many cases applied to real restoration projects. So let's move across the island and take a look at Cane Bay as one more example to explore how ecosystems are tied to resilience. Again, I'll leave it to the locals to correct me where I'm wrong, but for those who may not be familiar, I offer a brief description of the area. Cane Bay is located on the north shore of St. Croix. Located adjacent to or just a short walk from the beach are waterfront restaurants and a full-service dive shop, kayak rentals, and I think horseback riding too. You'll also find a beautiful white sand beach and areas for swimming and snorkeling. The Cane Bay Wall, a world-famous diving destination, is accessible from the shore or by boat. The reef starts in about 30 to 40 feet of water, where it drops off dramatically to a depth of over 3,000 feet. Cane Bay is a relatively quiet area with residential buildings and tourism-related structures. Here you can see various habitats associated with Cane Bay. Several guts drain from land into Cane Bay, and there are at least 2 large wetland areas. Large swaths of forest and shrub are adjacent to the bay, with a few patches of barren areas. The magenta or purple color represents coral cover. Cane Bay reefs were recently hit heavily by stony coral tissue loss disease, as were many reefs in the region. In 2019, local organizations created coral nurseries as part of a territory-wide coral restoration effort. And more recently, I believe local experts are treating some reefs for the stony coral tissue loss disease. So given that, I thought we'd take a brief look at logic chains related to coral restoration. Like the earlier example we saw, we can see that creating new or restoring existing coral reef leads to changes in coral reef quality and quantity. This then offers wave attenuation services, and ultimately that provides humans property protection benefits. Because many residential and business-related buildings are located right along the North Shore, this outcome may be important to local stakeholders. Other outcomes that might be important to Crucians are economic activity and human health. Tourism-related business is especially important in Cane Bay, and specifically tied to the diving industry. And as we can see here, coral restoration efforts are linked to recreation activity such as scuba diving, snorkeling, and wildlife viewing, which affects jobs and other economic activity across the broader community, as well as the mental health and psychological well-being of folks living here. Now, I know these logic chains are very simple, But as we saw in our previous Great Pond example, if we consider the multiple pathways that single management action can take, in this case, hazard mitigation action, it can help us demonstrate the important linkages between those actions and their outcomes. And it can help communities make decisions. So we're going to move into our discussion session, and we'll be thinking about what your opinions are, and we'll be asking these questions to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Christine. I think the two great examples of incredibly important natural resource spots there in St. Croix, and I look forward to seeing what the community and stakeholders, how they feel and what they value. So are we transitioning to, you're going to do the survey, or is Dijani going to lead that discussion? I forgot, I apologize.
I'm doing this first session, Kim, thanks.
That's right, okay, great, go ahead.
Can y'all see the Mentimeter poll?
Yep.
Good, all right. So for those of you who may not be familiar, this is a polling software that we're using. And we're just going to ask you a series of questions using this software, but it does require you to please either using your laptop, desktop, cell phone, tablet, whatever device you'd like, and go to menti.com. And at the top of the screen here, you can see instructions. So menti.com, and then you enter the code with the numbers that you see there. And Kara is putting that into the chat box as well, if that's easier for you to access that way. So I'll give you all a moment to log on to that before we move on. Okay. So our first question is a ranking question, and I'd like for you to think about those outcomes I discussed in our examples. I'd like you to rank the human well-being outcomes that you think decision makers should prioritize for the St. Croix community. And if you have any questions on how to do this, chat our team here in the chat box. So as you can see, this allows live response to be viewed. We've got 3 folks who have entered their answers so far. So we're going to wait for more people to add their opinions here. I see someone chatted a question about property protection. So again, that is an outcome from a hazard mitigation activity related to restoration. So if you're interested in protecting your property, for example, if you live adjacent to a shoreline or maybe upland from a shoreline, if you or a management agency does restoration such as mangrove restoration, those mangroves offer ecosystem services such as capturing sedimentation from land, which might protect the land behind or adjacent to that mangrove ecosystem. So that's just one of many examples where you have the ecosystem working for you to your benefit. And there's other natural resources that also provide property protection benefits too. All right, we've got 10 responses so far. We'll wait a little bit longer. We've got 40 some participants on here, so subtracting our team here, we should have some more coming in. cultural and heritage values is maintaining first place. Human health is right behind. And second, this is kind of like a horse race. And for those of you who might not live on island, if you do conduct work regularly here, you're welcome to offer your thoughts as well. If you're a management representative or other decision maker too, please do offer your insights. Someone asked about social disruption. So in many cases, when we restore a natural ecosystem, those ecosystems protect parts of our community or actual structures, buildings, such as government buildings, schools, hospitals. And with that protection of those very important resources, we're then seeing less social disruption when a hazard does occur. So if we're protecting or building behind or far away from a vulnerable shoreline, if we have mangroves there or coral reefs that protect us from storm surge or wave energy, essentially we're protecting our buildings and structures. Or for example, if we're thinking about guts and where we develop in association with guts, you know, these are building decisions that we need to make in regards to within the context of the larger ecosystem. So we want to protect our social structures. All right, we have 16 responses. We're gonna wait a moment more before moving on, given our schedule here. Human health, cultural and heritage values are tied, it looks. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next question. So what habitat do you value as most important for hazard mitigation and resilience? Please type your answer. So 3, 4 responses so far. Upland forest and guts, mangroves, I've got a variety here. Guts are edging their way into reasoning, excellent. Maybe a side conversation about how do we actually spell guts. That's an ongoing debate here with my team. Is it with an H or without an H? All right, and unfortunately, I'm not able to scroll down to see more of these comments pop up, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to wait for more responses to come in.
Both spelling of guts is appropriate.
What was that, Kim? I'm sorry, I missed that.
I said, no, I've seen it in the literature spelled both ways.
Yes.
Guts. And
yes.
so, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
We've got 26 comments.
I use the H just to distinguish between intestinal problems.
Yes, that's normally what I aim toward as well. We're not talking about bellies.
Right.
Oh, 32 comments there. I'm going to wait a little bit longer. People seem to like this one. And please feel free to type in explanations as well as to why you choose any of these habitats, or put it in the chat. Okay, I am going to move on to the next question because we need to leave time for our next discussion. So finally, if you had to pick one, which type of mitigation activity do you feel would benefit St. Croix the most? Again, if you have any thoughts as to why you made this selection, go ahead and type that into the chat box. And if we have time later too, we'll have some discussion about that. Similarly, if you'd like to select the other option, you can put that in the chat box as well. And again, I'd like to reiterate that these are obviously not the only mitigation activities that we have at our disposal, but these are just, grouped here for ease of discussion. And we're going to be taking this feedback and using it to create scenarios for our report to the HMRP team. So this is really useful feedback for us to get a handle on what your preferences are in general terms when we create those scenarios. We got 19 responses so far. I'll wait a little bit longer. Okay, seems like perhaps folks are slowing down. So I'm gonna stop there and ask if anybody wants to raise their hand and offer some thoughts or comments or questions or chat in the box before we move on to our next set of questions.
Olasee did speak to reforestation efforts underway in St. Croix, and if you could weigh in a little bit about just what types of trees. I'm assuming they're native species that they're using, but maybe you could just provide a few comments on that, since it's seeming to be quite popular.
Yeah, what they do an inventory of the forest ecosystem at St. Croix, and of course, native is our chosen tree to use. Here you have the wetland restoration. I think the native trees cover everything because it also protect wetland. It also protect coral reef, and you have drought management technique. It also protect that too as well. So I agree with native forest plant restoration because the others example you have there, the forests do a whole lot in protecting. But we do have planting trees here in all of our program that we have is to plant native trees on the island here. Because they can withstand hurricanes and other issues, they were resistant to climate change and so forth, much better than exotic. Exotic trees tend to compete with native trees and take over, and exotic trees tend to impact the environment, some exotic trees.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
So Chris, are we moving on to the next question, or turning it over to Dijani at this point?
We are turning it over to Dijani at this point.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Good morning again, everyone. So now we'll be moving on to a community engagement discussion on poll. So the objective of this discussion is just to identify some of the ways that community are reliant on ecosystem services, and those services that they're reliant on, how can they communicate with various entities, being the government or other organizations around the island? How can they help them develop mitigation strategies and also influence their decision making? So for the first question, what obstacles keep individuals or communities from being involved in decisions that affect ecosystems? Answer with 3 words or phrases, please. Now we're just waiting for the responses to trickle in. Now I see we have responses from 7 people so far. If anybody would be willing to share why they gave those answers in the chat box, or if they may be willing to speak, feel free to do so.
Well, this is interesting. This for some of us, we've been participating in all 3 workshops on all 3 of the major islands, and there's definitely some consistent threads. I mean, awareness and or lack of knowledge, lack of information. Obviously, education empowers people, and so if it's either the content of their education or the nature of what they've learned may not apply well to understanding ecosystems, but it's clearly, to my perspective, I see a lot of the same things, and this is nationwide. This is not unique to the Virgin Islands, but I think there are some unique challenges here in the territory, especially around where people get their information and what they rely on. I mean, totally unrelated, but it reminds me of the discussion we're having here at UVI around vaccination. It's going to be mandatory in the fall, and there's a lot of misinformation out there that is bothering people about the risks associated with it. And so I suspect similar patterns, perhaps not as passionate or in the moment around the environment, affects us as well. How much do we value it? If you're struggling day to day to make ends meet, whether it's because of you're out of work or you don't make a lot of money, then your time is consumed taking care of your basic needs. And if there's a lot of uncertainty there, you really don't have time to think about some of these things. And yet, your quality of life as someone who has modest means versus someone who has a lot of means, the quality of life issues of this are similar in the sense that we want clean air, clean water, and what have you. But I think, I see a lot of similar patterns with the other islands.
I would say public relationship. We do not do a good job in public relationship. We live in a high-tech society,
right?
But people are not getting a message if you look at the cultural aspect, most local people listen to radio, talk shows. So we should do our homework on what media that to get the information out. And I think one of them is the radio talk show. Having some of this issue discussed, you get more people calling on these talk shows. And on St. Croix, if we're doing what we're doing right now, is that UVI, we should do it like in the west, the middle, and the east of the island. So I think they go right back to how to get our message out with the public relation, and that's not a very good, you don't really have a good strategy in doing that. So my work, I do all. I do from technology, and I do the basic to get people really out. In many of these meetings, you'll find the same people, you know, over and over, speaking to the choir, you know, getting the masses of people. You also go inside the school system too as well. And so you have to use the traditional method of getting people along with the technologies that combine both of them. And by doing that, I think you got more outcry to the community.
No, good points. Thank you, Olasee. That's I mean, we have to get better at reaching these audiences, you know, and then the type of communication, we shouldn't be, even if we have letters after our names, you know, we shouldn't be preaching or telling people, we should be listening. We should be meeting them where they are, both physically and intellectually, and finding common ground to then, to your point, highlight the value, importance of the environment to the quality of their life, regardless of their, you know, their standing in the community. But we have to do a better job.
For example, I use myself. I get calls and emails from all over the world. The reason for that, because I established the Hiking Association more than 25 years ago. So I visible in the community, visible at UVI, and I get called every day, not just here, but internationally, for example. And so yesterday I have someone come to my office, they were the issue with the environment. But because I'm writing in the paper for more than 25 years, writing in the Daily News or in the Avis, people see that and they contact me, not only people locally, but people nationally, internationally. So that's, for me, I reach a lot of people on the street. When I go to church, people stop me. When I go to store, people stop me. Wherever I go, oh, use the guy that's doing A, B, C, and D. Because I use all sort of media and not just talk about it, I live it. So the environment is a lifestyle.
Right.
You know, the culture is a lifestyle, not just doing scientific research, but exactly living it. And people like that, they gravitated to you and so forth. So that's why I reach people from all walks of life.
No, good points. You're clearly an ambassador for the environment, and to your point, you know, you're not just talking the talk, you're walking the walk. And I think that's incredibly important, because that builds that trust that you talked about earlier in your presentation, that when researchers are working with communities, you know, to engage them, to relate to them, you know, that trust has to be built before people open up. And you've done that for decades. So we appreciate your work there. Others, any others?
So there's one in the chat. Shaprice Henry asks if there are any structures in place that allow communities' values to be incorporated into decision-making processes. I will lean on my colleagues from St. Croix if anyone at St. Croix would like to answer that question.
This is Kimiko from the EPA. I know I don't live on St. Croix, but we got a lot of participants from St. Croix on our SMM webinar series, and we're using that as a sort of launching board to try and form subgroups to try and get all of the ideas and that were presented during the conference and in the brainstorming session into action. And we're going to be working with DP&R and waste management to see if we can not only get them going, but get them incorporated into the integrated sustainable materials management plan, like the formal plan, and figure out how we can weave all those ideas in. So insofar as the question of engaging community and pulling in community values, we're hoping that this work and this type of approach will maybe catch on with all the different agencies for all the decision making, so that the government follows the people rather than the people following the government, so that the public is sort of the foundation of all the decision making.
Oh, that's helpful. And that's consistent with what we're seeing in our work on the hazard mitigation plan. When we engage, the earlier you engage communities, to listen, the more they are going to buy into especially the outcomes, especially because they've had a voice, they've had a chance to articulate, their needs, their challenges, or their ideas. And you don't come to them late in the game and tell them, "Oh, this is what we're going to do. What do you think?" You've lost them, or you've not engaged them at that point. And so it's absolutely essential. And I think more and more researchers are hopefully learning this or realizing this, but at the same time, this isn't limited to research. This is limited to community engagement, involvement. This goes back to some of the earlier questions of, what are the barriers that prevent people from weighing in or sharing their perspectives. We have to engage them soon, early in the process, and make them feel like they're part of the discussion.
Yeah, I agree. A government for the people, by the people.
Exactly.
I agree. Many times we have development on the islands, the people that last to know, instead of they're there from the beginning. So if you're there from the beginning, you won't have much confrontation because they understand what you're doing and they can give their 2-cent piece into the whole development. And what happens is they do all the development on paper and then they bring it to the public and say, "This is what we're doing." And they get resistance. So from the beginning, if you're going to do something, you come to the public so they could buy into it. And from there, you kind of go ahead with what you plan to do. But a lot of time is the opposite. So you got a resistance from the community, wherever you're trying to do, because some of the public values these development impact as well. A good example with the Great Pond. I'm familiar with the Great Pond, a lot of the history in the Great Pond and so research. The proposed hotel, I thought that I went to court, and the fishermen used on the western part of the Great Pond. Now it's fenced up. They don't use it anymore. They fence the whole area, so the fishermen cannot go in there to the Great Pond, as they do in the past, where they catch the fish, and they kept conchs and lobster and that sort of thing. And that's a good example because they were not in from the beginning with the proposed development that took place. And now it's not being used by the fishermen anymore. They're being locked out. So that creates friction within the community when it comes to development. And that's a good example.
Oh, thank you for that. We've got a lot of hands raised. I want to give folks a chance. Sam H., go ahead and unmute yourself, and then we go to Hillary and Celeste.
Hi, this is Sam. As someone who's worked in both media and was hands-on during the post-Maria mitigation and strategic planning and all of that, I will say one of the major roadblocks or things that are keeping the community from getting involved is that when locals feel that no matter what they say or do, their voices are not given enough weight, being the ones who will be subject to whatever decisions are being made, you will see complacency start to kick in. Because during that process, we saw people coming out in droves in the beginning, but more and more as there were comments made to the effect of, "Oh, you don't have to study that person," or "You don't have to listen to them." Being dismissed when you've been born and raised, you were born and raised in a region, and I won't just say an island, but I'll say the region. And people who have never really been through a storm, maybe that was their first storm, are given more weight than you who have seen the progression of storm systems and their effects on the island. It becomes a thing where people become disenchanted. So I think if we want the people to participate, you have to let them know that their voices matter, their concerns count, and give them an actual stake in what's happening. Because if people don't feel like they are invested, they're not going to care either way, and they're going to turn their attention to the immediate things that they can affect, like what's happening in their own household. On top of that, there needs to be greater collaboration with government, where the government gives people, again, the weight of their words. Let the weight of the people's words have effect on the government, rather than us just being subjected to whatever deals government decides to forge for the fiscal coffers and to shore up GERS, and then all the rest of the population is just left to bear the brunt of what's happening. I think those are some of the major issues we're having. And as far as media is concerned, you can be an educational show, but you're not going to get the attention and or the call-in as the shows that tend to traffic in more of the melee-ish things. And that's from somebody who actually does do an educational show. So you see that we need to change that kind of focus, where we not only just talk about this is the issue, but you have to then outline to the people, this is how it impacts you, this is what you can do to fix it.
Oh, great points. Thank you, Sam. Let's go to Hillary.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Hillary Lohman. I'm the Coastal Resilience Coordinator with the Department of Planning and Natural Resources. I just want to add a bit of like administrative context with regard to decision making, which is to say that for major land and water use earth change permit applications that come through DPNR in the Tier 1 division of CZM, Coastal Zone Management, for big changes to the land and the water, actually those decisions, even after the staff here reviews the application and has the time to ask for more, whatever, that goes to the director, and it goes from the director, actually it goes to a commission, which is a committee of a bunch of people who are Virgin Islanders, who don't work for the government, who are more than the commissioner at any given point in time. They are the people making the decision. They are the final say. It's written in the code that the committee and the commission of DPNR, which is, again, people elected to make decisions on behalf of Virgin Islanders. It's actually a very small group of elected Virgin Islanders who are behind the final say in a lot of these major, that would have to do with like major commercial development, marinas, things like that. So I just, those people change over time, you know, but I just wanted to point out that structurally, to the points that were asked about like structurally, whether they're, what are the channels versus the obstacles, structurally speaking, the power is with the people right now in terms of there being a commission who makes the final decision about major land and water use applications.
No, that's good to know, Hillary. And I think, you know, again, information is power. And I think if people know who's on that commission when these projects come up, hopefully they can reach them and, you know, and share their thoughts. Let's go to Celeste. She's had her hand up for a bit.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, I'm going to flip this a little bit. I'd like to see, because I'm a tour guide. I've also worked with FEMA, environmental and historic preservation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, one of the things that I want to go on, as what Olasee Davis stated earlier, when he goes out into the community, and, you know, people may know he's associated with the college, but he doesn't wear that college hat. He wears, I'm a Virgin Islander and I'm Olasee Davis. So people have no problem walking up, going to him and go, Olasee Davis, hi, what's up? Can we talk to you about something? When I walk out into the community, the same thing. People know who I am. I'm Celeste. Everybody talks to me as Celeste. We all have our gripes and stuff together. But I'm going to go back to something that happened years ago. I'm going to go back to HIV and AIDS. What they had to do to get into the community was drop the professionalism, this expertise foolishness. Not that you can't be an expertise, but you need to drop it when you go into the community. I've been in meetings where it's like, well, the expert says, I don't want to hear about the experts. The experts is the community, the individuals that are experts, not expat. That they're the individuals that are sitting down and actually living and breathing what's going on. So I would love to see the audience change. I would not only want to go to a meeting, and even if DPNR or whoever else is running that meeting, that they're at the front of the room. Get all of the citizens of the Virgin Islands, the islanders, to sit at the front of the room and let everybody else that's involved in this sit in the audience. And you'll have more of that conversation. They had to drop going out in the daytime. They started going into the bars and all the other places that was necessary at the hours that these operations were open, and they had to deal directly with the community. We know who the community organizations are. We know who the community people are. We need to associate and be present there at all times, not looking, and I mean, it's been said over and over again. I'm just giving a different aspect of it. Let's switch hats. Let's take the expert out of it. Let's be first hand based. Let's talk to everybody on that level. And I think we would have a much better understanding and clarity as to what, because they're the original experts.
No, point well taken. Thank you, Celeste. All right.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention too is that I think more things should go for public comment, and the public comment process is a critically important way to have your voice heard. And I advocate for everybody to be aware of the different public comment periods. Just judging, or just based on my own experience, it's extremely important and impactful to make public comment when there's an opportunity. I'm going to put in the chat something that explains the public comment period a little bit better. The publiccommentproject.org.
Well, this is a great segue. I think we've actually answered a number of this next question, but I think there's still an opportunity to get other folks to weigh in. So Dijani, go ahead.
All right, so we'll move on to the second question. Thank you, everybody, for that productive discussion. So how can people get more involved in decisions concerning the USVI ecosystem and their well-being? Again, if you could answer with 3 words or phrases.
While that's going on, this is Hillary again. I just added to the chat a link to CZM's website where the permits under review are listed.
We're just waiting for some responses to trickle in from the poll. We have 6 responses so far. And from what I'm seeing, a lot of these responses reflect just a part of the conversation that was going on just a while ago. With people feeling that they need to be going towards the people more instead of bringing them to public forums, and just are interacting with them on a more personal level than anything else. just wait and see if we have any more responses to come in. And if not, then we'll move to the next question. So it looks like we may be capped at 11. So let's move on to the third question. So are there any success stories concerning local ecosystems where community engagement resulted in positive change? Please type your response. Seems we have 3 responses so far. Just waiting for some more to come in. So the two that have piqued my interest are the purchase of Saltgate and a decision not to build an aerospace facility at Great Pond East. If the persons who gave those answers, if they would like to expound on them a little bit, I would appreciate it.
Sure, this is Hillary. And the decision, I don't remember exactly the details of the aerospace facility whose idea that was, but that was about purchasing the land. Right now, the plot, it's a government plot. It's where the Easton Marine Park office is, which is DPNR, but it's also, that field is actually owned by Department of Sports, Parks and Recreation. That field, which is, it is east of Great Pond. And that was, yeah, there was a time, I believe in the 70s or 80s, that it was up for sale and someone was going to buy it to build what I understood was a rocket ship building facility or something. And, you know, similar to the casino that didn't get built at Great Pond, but I guess in terms of something that was certainly under consideration and then decided against, I know that that is just a piece of history at that plot. I'm the one who mentioned it. I'm sure I'm not the most informed on its history, perhaps on this call, but to answer your question, that was me, and that's true.
Well, I'm familiar with both of them. I'm a member with C. The C Southgate was donated by a donor to us. I was on the board at that particular time. So that's how the Southgate Pond was protected, because of a donor. At the Great Pond, I went to court to protect that area. It's a long history, but I won't go into all the details. The land was belonged to the people in perpetuity, and the government wanted to exchange the land to a developer. And it caused a big uproar and synchronized, it came internationally. So I was the leading testifier at the court, and we won that. In terms of the Marine Park, I was in there from the beginning. I was an individual that wrote the rules and regulation to establish the Marine Park that exists today. So a lot of these issues, I was involved and synchronized in St. Thomas. Megan's Bay, we with the government tumble near the conservancy. I'm a member for over 20 years. I purchased land, the watershed, to be part of Megan's Bay. So Megan's Bay is a good example. In St. John, I was involved in the Trust for Public Land, and for centuries trying to get land which is within a national park. And finally, we talked to the family members of that, and that was purchased through the Trust for Public Land, and it become part of the national park. So a lot of this issue in the Warner, I was involved from way back in the beginning and trying to, and a good example, the eastern area we're working on right now, which is protected, but it need to be re-educated to the public. And I was involved in that. Again, and we went to court, and a donor came in, get the land to the conservancy. So the whole eastern now is protected, and the other side was Philip Dickinson, and that was given to the people. And so again, many of the issues that we see today, I was involved in Salt River to become a national park. We testified in Congress. So a lot of these issues that we have today in the voice, not just in St. Croix, but all the three islands, I was involved with those issues.
Thanks. Thank you, Hillary and Olasee, for those positive stories. The rocket ship one was very interesting. Let's move on now to our final question. So in 3 words, how do you usually get your news or information about decisions that affect USVI ecosystems? I think Mr. Davis touched on this earlier with his talk. So now if you guys can just say it again in the poll, how you personally get your information.
I added a link to an old, like an archived St. Croix source article about the Beale Aerospace facility not happening. If that's of interest to anyone.
Thank you, Hillary, for adding that link. It seems that we're up to 5 responses so far, with local news and newspapers being the leading ones.
It looks like Celeste added in the chat, she talked about email lists, which is obviously another way people get information, updates from environmental or other community organizations.
Can I? Hello.
Oh.
This is Celeste. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to add. I want to add something else, like the Eastern Marine Park. I also listed it, and the reason is I've been on many hikes with the students, and I think I'm not talking about college students. I think another place that we are not talking about a lot is just the high school students going in front of the classrooms. I know Olasee Davidson has done a lot of that as well, but they are a great resource. You know, once they find out, they talk, like they talk about herd immunity with diseases, they talk to each other on a regular basis. They find out something and it spreads, and it doesn't just spread throughout their community as far as students, but it spreads throughout their community as far as going home, their younger siblings, you know, other family members, their community. That's how it spreads. And that's the spread that we need to talk about. Okay, because that's how they find out. That's how that's how their parents sometimes find out. If you're dealing with marketing, you know, before marketers educated, stuff on TV commercials were geared for children, toys, or as far as in television, you know, and then the children will turn around and tell their mother, oh, that's what I want for Christmas. And so this is another area that we need to start to look at more and address more.
Oh, absolutely. I think I mean, young people, their minds are more open. They're naturally curious. I know from our work with VIF score, we have K-12, K-16, efforts underway because young people, they're frankly just simply more open-minded. And to your point, they communicate and socialize far more than older folks. So, point well taken.
And if I could add to that just a little, I got a lot of my interest in ecology and biology and just the environment when I was around my teenage years. So I do think also it's very important to do that. It seems we're at 8 responses. That may be the last set of responses we have. And that would conclude our poll, if so.
All right, well, thank you. We are 2 minutes away from the end of our scheduled time. On behalf of the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience team, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, number one. I think we've had really good exchanges of ideas, which was really one of the key objectives for the workshop, is to hear from folks in St. Croix and folks who care about St. Croix. So thank you for that. I also want to thank my colleagues and presenters, especially Professor Olasee Davis for joining us today and sharing a wealth built on decades of, as I mentioned earlier, walking and talking about the environment through generations of Crucians and Virgin Islanders, as well as internationally. So thanks for that. I'd like to give Dr. David Yoskowitz, the director for the Hart Institute, an opportunity to say a few words before we close out.
Thanks, Kim. No, it's been a great week, talking about St. Thomas, St. John, and today St. Croix. I've learned a lot through the process, and I hope we've been able to share a lot with all of you about the importance of connecting, what's happening in our natural systems, ecosystems, with human well-being, and then how that can be used for hopefully some effective decision-making around hazard mitigation and building resilience within the islands. So thank you also to the team, Chris and Kara and Michael and Dijani and Christopher and others that I failed to mention. Of course, you, Kim, and Greg as well. So thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we'll close this meeting. And again, thanks to everyone for participating. I know you're busy, so we really appreciate the input. Thank you.